Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Archives, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, which is made possible by the generous support of the Miriam Mimi Pasternak Taube Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives. Let me start by saying a few words about the JDC Archives for those of you who don't know us. The JDC Archives holds the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC or the Joint, since the organization's creation over 100 years ago. As such, it is one of the most important repositories for the study of modern Jewish history. Scholars from around the world, as well as family researchers, journalists, filmmakers, and others use our collection for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. And one of these fellowships is the Max and Cecil Stower-Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established thanks to a generous gift from Dr. Soel and Lauren Chessin in 2019 to honor Soel's parents. On behalf of the archives, I want to thank Soel, who is with us today, for his generosity. Soel Chessin will actually introduce our speaker today, Johannes Glack, who received the fellowship in 2024. After Soel's introduction, Johannes will speak for about 45 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are muted. You will be able to send us questions via the Q&A function, both during the lecture and after the lecture. And Soel Chessin will now introduce Johannes Glack.
Johannes Glack is a contemporary historian and doctoral researcher at the Department of Contemporary History of the University of Vienna, where he is engaged in the ERC project, Global Resettlement Regimes, Ambivalent Lessons Learned from the Post-War, 1945 to 1951. His research focuses on the migration processes of Jewish displaced persons with health-related challenges from 1945 to 1963. Prior to joining the Institute of Contemporary History, he worked as a research assistant for the Yad Vashem Archive and contributed to various national and international projects in the field of Shoah remembrance and commemoration work. Johannes will be a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum from September to December of this year. He is also the recipient of the Max and Cecil Stoyer-Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship for 2024. Johannes Glack will now start his lecture.
Thank you, Soel Chessin and Isabel Rohr, for the kind introduction. And welcome to my talk about the global perspectives on the JDC's assistance to Jewish DPs with health-related challenges 1945 to 1963. As Mr. Chessin has mentioned, I'm part of a bigger research group. Some of my colleagues are here today. Hello. Funded by the European Union and at the University of Vienna at the Department for Contemporary History. The project was launched in 2023 and is headed by Professor Kerstin Kumlingen. If you want to learn more about our project, please follow the QR code on the slide. It will bring you to our project's homepage. To briefly talk about my sources for today's talk, it is based on sources from the JDC archives, of course. And besides that, I also utilized sources from the French National Archives, the Arolsen Archives, as well as some Austrian archives. In my dissertation, I scrutinize migration processes of Shoah survivors with health-related challenges in a global perspective. I follow the question of how survivors were hindered at first in their migration efforts due to violence-induced health issues, and how later migration schemes for rehabilitation and rehabilitation programs for this specific group were established and organized in Europe and Asia. Just to give you a brief outline of the next 45 minutes, the lecture is structured in 4 parts. Beginning in Europe, I will give you an overview of the situation of survivors suffering from various chronic illnesses and how their physical disposition excluded them from migration. Here we'll specifically focus on the JDC facilitating rehabilitation efforts for Jewish DPs by taking a closer look at one rehabilitation center. From there, I will take you a few thousand miles around the globe to look at the situation of elderly, chronically ill survivors in Shanghai. We will follow them on the way to a new life in Israel and learn about the situation of Olim with special health needs who arrived in Israel in 1950. And for the last part, I will return to Europe and provide insights into the living conditions of those who were unable to migrate and still had to live in refugee camps throughout the 1950s. The issue of resettlement of Jewish DPs with health challenges is closely connected to the period of the IRO between 1948 and 1951. The IRO actually began to work 1 year earlier. The IRO, the International Refugee Organization, was responsible for the resettlement of displaced persons. After the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, which ended its operations in 1947, just to give you a quick overview over the international organizations responsible for the displaced persons in one sentence. Under the administration of UNRWA, the main concern was providing basic medical care and infrastructure, and foremost, the prevention of outbreaks of epidemics. So resettlement was not a topic for the UNRWA yet. Between 1948 and 1952, over 1 million displaced persons were resettled worldwide with the help of the IRO. Preceding and accompanying this process were intensive negotiations between the IRO and states around the world for resettlement schemes. Humanitarianism and charity were not the driving forces of receiving countries in accepting DPs. Rather, as Daniel Cohen has elaborated, it was an economic urge to utilize this available pool of laborers. This resulted in the exclusion of refugees with chronic health conditions or in any other way declared disabled and so-called economically unuseful in the first years after 45. The IRO's health division's doctrine that the refugee's health is his passport to any new world required the IRO to maintain a system of clinics, hospitals, and sanatoria, which was mostly inherited from the UNRWA. So DPs had to undergo medical checks twice normally, first when entering a camp and once again during the selection process of migration. Recruiting missions of numerous countries toured the DP camps in Western Germany, Austria, and Italy, searching for single, young, sturdy workers with good health for their resettlement programs. Once rejected by a selection mission due to health, DP became part of the so-called hardcore. This is a source term utilized by the IRO and numerous organizations, just like the JDC, to describe displaced persons with disabilities and other issues for whom resettlement was considered unlikely. DPs with disabilities under the label medical hardcore were just one category of hardcore DPs. Besides health, age, being a single mother, or a criminal record, among other reasons, accounted for receiving hardcore status. Now, if we look at Jewish DPs, they made up around 1/3, I would estimate, of the total hardcore DP population. About numbers, I will get into that in a second. But before I look at how Jewish DPs with hardcore status were excluded from resettlement, before the foundation of Israel in 1948, one could assess that being Jewish with a hardcore status resulted in the least favorable preconditions for migration. Not just were Jewish DPs particularly affected by health problems due to their specific history of persecution and suffering during the Shoah. They also faced a disadvantage in the organization and implementation of post-World War II migration processes. In 1947, for example, a Jewish agency commission visited DP camps in Europe and prepared a report on their health with the aim to, as quoted, preventing the immigration of medically unfit persons to Eretz Israel, so as not to place any additional burden on the Jewish population in Palestine, as the research of Ada Schein has shown. Very interesting paper. This de facto exclusion from immigration continued even after May 48, with only a fraction of hardcore cases being able to enter Israel until 1950. I will get into this in the third part of this talk and elaborate further. If we look at the situation in the US, the second most important receiving country for survivors of the Shoah, we see a similar picture of exclusion in this period. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which regulated the immigration of European refugees to the US, practically excluded Jewish DPs in general and refugees who were unable to work in particular. Only an improvement to the DP Act in 1950 simplified Jewish immigration efforts, but the situation for DPs with specific health conditions remained difficult. To improve resettlement possibilities for DPs in general, with hardcore status, the IRO's Health Division launched their efforts for a specific rehabilitation program for DPs with disabilities in March 1948. Over the course of 1 year, the IRO, together with external advisors, aided by the JDC and other organizations, planned an extensive rehabilitation program for these hardcore DPs. And from 1940 onwards, rehabilitation centers were established as the core component of this program. If you want to learn more about this program, I recently wrote a paper on it, which will be published hopefully by the end of the year in a special issue. In course of planning of the rehabilitation program, the IRO also conducted a hardcore survey in 1948 to determine the numbers of affected DPs. It determined that in Germany, Austria, and Italy, 27,000 refugees could be classified as medical hardcore. Of these 27,000, a survey found around 12,000 were tuberculosis patients, so roughly half. 2,000 had lost a limb, and just as many came under the category of venereal diseases, while 5,000 suffered from various undefined chronic illnesses. Patients with mental illnesses and blindness accounted for the smallest percentage. It must be noted that the JDC and even voices within the IRO questioned these numbers, claiming that they must be higher. And as you can see on the slide, half a year later, the estimations within the IRO were almost doubled. You can see that health is accounted with 48,900 DPs in this document on the slide. As you can also see on the slide, the JDC conducted their own survey, but was only able to obtain solid numbers for the US zone of Germany, and only an estimation for Austria of 1,700 hardcore DPs, Jewish hardcore DPs. For Italy, no statistical data was available. These numbers were put together, and the result of this JDC survey was that at least 4,200 Jewish hardcore DPs were within Germany, Austria, and Italy. But this number must be considered too low. In another document I found from 1949 within the JDC archives, the total caseload of hardcore DPs anticipated to arrive in Israel from Europe is estimated with 12,000, which seems to me to be the more plausible number. Anyway, hardcore DPs often had families or family members whose migration was also hindered for one reason, because they had to decide whether to leave some loved one behind or stay with them in Europe until they were healthy enough to be allowed to emigrate. Ruth Balint has written a very interesting paper on this issue, specifically on children left behind. That's also the name of the paper. Taking those family members into consideration, the number of DPs whose migration was prevented by health is at least doubled, when not maybe even more. Now, who were these Jewish hardcore DPs in Europe? Just like the Sherit Tableta in general, they were a very diverse group coming from different backgrounds with different biographies of survival. Within this heterogeneity, two shared characteristics can be identified. Firstly, almost all of them were disabled as a consequence of the Shoah and not by birth. And a second cohesive factor among this group can be found in the fact that they all wished to migrate and start anew somewhere else, but were hindered at some point in their migration due to their health situation. To foster their migration opportunities, the JDC and the IRO ran a system of rehabilitation centers, as already mentioned, which I will go into right now. The establishment of rehabilitation centers for DPs was the central instrument of in supporting DPs with disabilities. They were supposed to provide follow-up healthcare for DPs after leaving hospitals, while mainly focusing on the vocational training aspect of rehabilitation. Each center should host up to 200 DPs and be located not too far from DP camps where the families of the rehabilitees lived, and also near big cities. At its peak in November 1949, there were 15 centers in Germany, 2 centers in Austria, and 2 in Italy, and 1 in Switzerland, which comes to a total of 20 IRO rehabilitation centers. Many of these were managed together with the JDC, in case of the Jewish rehabilitation centers, while the Jewish aid organization ORT provided vocational training, as you can see in the picture in the slide. And the center in Switzerland was cooperated by the French Jewish organization OSE. All the other centers were run by the JDC. In Austria, the IRO did not manage to open an own rehabilitation center until mid-1949, and only then took over the rehabilitation center for Jewish DPs in Ebelsberg from the JDC. The JDC had established this rehabilitation center during the summer of 1948 by using 2 barracks within DP camp Davidstern in Linz, or especially in the part of Linz called Ebelsberg for it. This camp was located near the city of Linz, as mentioned, in Upper Austria, in the US zone of Austria. You can see the location, how it looks today here on this aerial photo on the slide. It was later used by the Austrian army as army base and recently closed down. I don't know what will happen to this area now. I think they don't have agreed on plans. With the progressive migration of survivors to Israel in 1948 and 1949, Jewish camps were closed down all over Europe. But the remaining hardcore cases unable to go to Israel had to be transferred somewhere. Most of those not medically eligible for Israel and not in medical institutions, meaning those in camps, were transferred to this center in Ebelsberg, similar to the situation in Germany, where Jewish DPs were also transferred to rehabilitation centers if they were not medically eligible for Israel. This created a housing problem in the rehabilitation centers. And in Ebelsberg, at this point, the IRO stepped in and adopted Ebelsberg Center as an IRO facility. Although the IRO hoped to be of some assistance, the JDC was not too happy with the cooperation, as an internal JDC report from July 1949 reveals, quote, "The situation in Ebelsberg became unbearable. We had very little control of who came into the center, but were constantly asked for assistance, food, and personnel." Ebelsberg was not the only center managed this way. First rehabilitation center under JDC and IRO cooperation was established in Passau. in November 1948, located in a border town between Bavaria and Upper Austria in the US zone. It offered also art courses in typewriting, machine sewing, leatherwork, dressmaking, radio skills, and telephone techniques, just like in Ebelsberg. Another rehabilitation center for Jewish DPs was located, for example, in Bayerisch Gmein, also in the US zone, already replacing the center in Passau. So they were opened and closed down very quickly. The IRO managed the rehabilitation program in these cooperated centers and provided physicians, X-ray facilities for tuberculosis checks, medical equipment, while the JDC managed the day-to-day business and was involved financially. This cooperation was necessary for the IRO, owing to the program's financial situation, as noted in the Austrian IRO health report from June 1949. We have been obliged to request the JDC to continue to look after the financial side of the centers, which they have accepted until we are in a position to assume the financial responsibilities as well. Which brings me to my case study of strikes in Ebelsberg Rehabilitation Center. In July 1949, over 350 hardcore patients were housed in Ebelsberg, meaning over 150 more than it was anticipated to. Maybe due to this management situation and certainly owing to the overcrowding, protests arose. The traces of these protests offer the opportunity to learn something about the daily life within these facilities today for researchers. A group of protesters calling themselves Strike Committee wrote the protest note, as you can see it on the slide, which they sent to several newspapers and organizations, and at the beginning of July 1949 even went on hunger strike to empathize their demands against the organization of the center. You can see the pamphlet here in the slide. It lists 5 points, all connected to the health situation, and concludes with the underlined statement that they are starving. This petition was signed by 38 persons in representation of 151 camp inhabitants. The JDC reacted swiftly and tried to improve the situation in the camp, but also claimed that the protesters were overreacting, as expressed in the following statement. They want to go to Israel, but are told that because of the state of their health, they cannot now be moved. This leads many of them to complain of everything, including food and clothing. It is their hopeless view of the future that makes them restless. By referring to the difficult migration possibilities, the joint representative shifted the point of the protest away from the camp. The protests were also belittled as isolated individual acts. The JDC but also reviewed the center and adjusted some issues, but overall assessed that the conditions there were already far better than in most other DP camps. Half a year later, a second group organized a protest in Ebelsberg, building on the protest experience of the previous summer. This time they tried to put their efforts on a larger footing. Under the name Committee for the Weekend Olim, they held a congress in Ebelsberg on May 7th, 1950. Olim is the Hebrew expression for someone conducting Aliyah. Approximately 50 people participated at the congress. From what I can say so far, most of them came from the center itself or the larger area of the city of Linz. At the Congress, a resolution was drafted and the further proceedings were discussed. All Jewish DPs who were suffering from health problems should be united in an association in order to collectively demand better migration conditions from the IRO and the Jewish Agency. Interestingly, the central demands of the resolution were not primarily focused on healthcare, but also on work opportunities. Out of the 6 demands of the resolution, 4 referred directly to the issue of work capability. In one of the paragraphs, the urge to be trained in agricultural work, following by a call for the lift of custom regulations in order to allow them to take all their belongings with them, especially working equipment for their newly learned trades from the rehabilitation center. This should make it easier for them to build up a new self-supporting existence. So it was very important to them to make clear that they are willing and able to work in order to foster their migration possibilities. The resolution was concluded with the paragraph that the sick Jewish DPs will not stay one day longer in the land of Mauthausen and Ebensee, and that improvements in the healthcare conditions in Israel must be provided so that they could leave immediately. It's very interesting that this is one of the only traces I have where the Shoah is mentioned directly. In many cases, the IRO did not mention why these refugees were there in the first place at all. The minutes of the Congress and a call to support the resolution were sent to residents of other rehabilitation centers in Germany and Italy. Very interestingly, they tried to connect with, over the borders of their own center. Only the letter to the inhabitants of the Grotte Ferrata camp in a center in Italy has been preserved, and you can see the Yiddish original on the slide. The Ebelsberg Rehabilitation Center was closed a few months later, and most of the inhabitants were able to migrate to Israel in 1950. Only a few had to remain in Austria, and I will look into them in the last part of this lecture. With this case study on Ebelsberg Rehabilitation Center, I hope I was able to give you some first impressions on the situation in Europe. For the next part, I will now turn to the situation in Asia. I will focus here on a case study on Shanghai. This is where I found the thickest data on. Shanghai was an important safe haven for Jewish refugees from Austria and Germany. They survived the Shoah there and were there in 1945. Another important place in Asia, among others, would be the Philippines, where the research of my colleague Lena Christoph is focusing on. Very interesting. On a side note, just to illustrate the global scale of the issue of hardcore refugees and the care that JDC provided them, just recently I looked into the situation of hardcore refugees in the Caribbean, and I found some cases in Santo Domingo, which the capital of the Dominican Republic, which were stuck there due to the health situation throughout the 1950s. Where the JDC also provided care for a handful of these chronically ill survivors in Santo Domingo. A very similar case to Shanghai on a much smaller scale. While in Europe, the average hardcore DP was middle-aged and suffered from tuberculosis, the hardcore population in Shanghai consisted mainly of elderly DPs suffering from age-related illnesses. As mentioned, they had survived in Shanghai and other cities in China and awaited resettlement there. During this period, after 1945, many refugees had left their homes in Shanghai and liquidated businesses or ended employment, as stated in a JDC memo from 1949 about the refugee situation there. Also, the economic situation in China forced another large percentage out of employment, which put pressure on the IRO to find solution. Especially elderly and chronically ill DPs were in a very difficult situation. Many were unable to support themselves only by fulfilling, or were able to support themselves only by fulfilling smaller household works for neighbors, like doing laundry or cleaning flats. But with the ongoing of resettlement, this income opportunity omitted. Each transport leaving Shanghai left more and more elderly hardcore DPs without work and thus relying entirely on JDC and IRO support. In December 1949, expectations on finding a quick solution for the hardcore DPs were dim. It was estimated by the JDC that with the end of June 1950, more than 3,000 DPs would still be in Shanghai and without expectation of resettlement. Half a year later, the actual numbers looked fortunately better. In May 1950, there were, according to the JDC, 350 hardcore cases in Shanghai, of which 205 were male and 145 were female. As depicted in the slide, most of them were over 65 years old. The majority registered under the category of old age suffered from different age-related illnesses like arteriosclerosis, asthma, or diabetes. Just a fraction of the hardcore DPs in Shanghai were not elderly. From the 350 hardcore DPs, only 33 were under the age of 40, most of them DP cases. The option of integrating a part of this hardcore population into the general population, which was one major line of IRO negotiations with governments in Europe, was impossible in China due to the political situation. There was I will not go into that. It's another topic. Of the 350 hardcore DPs in Shanghai, 271 left for Israel on the IRO ship and Selin on September 10, 1950 from Tianjin. The remaining refugees didn't want to go to Israel and had to stay in Shanghai for a longer period of time until the JDC found permanent placing for them. Before I go into the bigger group going to Israel, I will shortly dwell upon the DPs who stayed behind. All in all, the JDC and the UNHCR took care of the remaining refugees and negotiated agreements for every single one of them. Mostly in small groups, around 10 people. They were resettled via plane to Portugal, Ireland, France, Belgium, or Switzerland. In October 1953, for example, a Swiss scheme for old hardcore refugees in China was agreed on, and the first group of 10 was resettled by plane in May 1954 to a nursing home in Switzerland. Another group was resettled from Hong Kong a few months later in 2 flights with 5 refugees each to Switzerland. Also in 1954, 10 cases were accepted by France and resettled to a nursing home near Paris. And until 1956, the rest of the hardcore in China was resettled in a similar way. By the end of 1955, all but 20 cases had permanent solutions, as you can see on the slide, on the list on the slide. In the end, for many, going to Israel was the best option, after all, as can be seen by the marker Malben besides the names. What that means will become clear now when I talk about the situation in Israel. In respect of the turbulent situation of state building in Israel, the Palestine office in Shanghai had refused to grant entry visas for Israel to anyone over 60 up to April 1950. Only then an agreement between the IRO and the State of Israel opened up migration possibilities for the hardcore DPs still in Shanghai. A comparable situation applied for the hardcore DPs in Europe. From the foundation of the state in 1948, almost all Jewish DPs were able to emigrate to the new home relatively quickly. Only those declared medically not eligible, the medical hardcore, mostly had to remain in Europe. Due to the War of Independence, the hospitals in Israel were overcrowded with wounded soldiers and civilians, and it was simply not possible to admit DPs in need of care from Europe. Even for those who did not need to be hospitalized, there was a lack of care facilities, and healthcare was in general very difficult to supply. The JDC constantly worked on this issue together with the Jewish Agency, and an agreement between the State of Israel and the IRO was achieved in October 1949, enabling the migration of 1,690 hardcore DPs from Europe to Israel within 1 year. This number was enlarged a few months later, and Israel received compensations for each immigrant with hardcore status, just like any other receiving state. Parts of this compensation went into the establishment of care facilities under the so-called Malben program. This aid program was implemented by the JDC and Israel at the financial expense of the IRO. Malben is a Hebrew acronym that can be translated into English as Institution for the Care of Handicapped Immigrants. And just as the name indicates, the purpose of this program was to create facilities to accommodate all disabled and handicapped immigrants in Israel. Thus, from 1950 onwards, Jewish DPs from rehabilitation centers, sanatoriums, and hospitals were finally able to migrate to Israel. However, as the establishment of the Malben program was less rapid in practice, then the arriving immigrants often found unfinished or inadequate facilities. I found several accounts of complaints from hardcore groups coming from Europe and Asia to Israel in 1950, which today give us the opportunity to learn something about the daily struggles of living with special health requirements in Israel in 1950. For one such example, we will return to the group arriving from Shanghai in November 1950 after 2 months' journey on the IRO ship in Israel. On the ship were over 60 patients who needed severe medical care, 36 of which were mental patients. Due to the lack of hospital beds on the ship, many of the 271 hardcore DPs volunteered to stay in regular quarters on the ship, thinking that this was just a practical issue. This, however, led to them being registered as regular immigrants upon arrival, despite their hardcore status. As a result, they had to stay in regular immigration camps, which were unsuitable to their medical needs. After several inquiries to the Jewish Agency, they learned that 110 hardcore cases, all individuals who couldn't be cared for in the ship's hospital, had been registered as regular immigrants, and the reason was the general lack of healthcare facilities in the country. Israel argued that the IRO had yet paid less than what was agreed on, so there were no funds to build further homes for elderly faster. Some members of the Shanghai group, all housed in the Ein Shema immigration camp, formed a group to collectively exercise the agency and demand better accommodation from the IRO or the State of Israel, or funds to return to the countries of origin in Europe. As the picture shows, these transit camps often consisted of tin huts or wooden barracks and were not equipped for long-term housing as they lacked furniture and space. One can imagine that it was not very comfortable living there for elderly DPs or elderly immigrants. Since hardcore immigrants often were unable to support themselves, they had little or no chance to find other accommodations without financial support. It was the case with the group of German-speaking refugees from Shanghai. This self-organized group consists of 32 elderly DPs from Germany and Austria, most of them between 60 and 70 years old, with the oldest being 77 years. Georg Löwenstein, a 61-year-old physician from Germany, was elected a spokesman for this group, but later also other members wrote appeals to the IRO. And I was able to locate these letters within the IRO archive, fortunately. The first letter sent to the IRO arrived at January 51. And they stated in this letter, if the old people in Shanghai had known beforehand that the promises made to them did not correspond to the intentions of the Israeli government, there can be no doubt that most of them, being old and no longer fit for work, would have preferred either to stay in Shanghai or to go back to their countries of origin. They claimed that they had been brought here on false promises and having been treated so unjustly were anxious to return to their countries of origin. After the IRO replied that they had no funds for that, since they already resettled them. The group stated that since we are penniless, we are therefore compelled to remain here against our will. Very drastic. IRO forwarded the complaints to the JDC, who were responsible for building care facilities within the Malben project. The JDC explained that indeed people have been taken off the list from this specific ship, but some had since been reassessed and admitted to Malben institutions, and also that they had received several similar complaints from other immigrants from the same ship arriving with the same transport. The JDC stated if they need institutional care, they must remain in the camps and wait for their turn. In a second letter, sent 8 months after the group's arrival in Israel, the group again criticized their accommodation in regular camps, which they could not leave. Amongst other things, they described the lack of furniture and space, having no chairs to sit on despite their age. Emigration to Europe or being transferred to homes for elderly were the only option they saw. They demanded an intervention from the IRO, claiming that whom can we still trust if even the IRO has forsaken us? The letter ends with a tragic account that one of the group members had committed suicide since he saw no hope for a better life anymore and didn't receive the care he would have needed. In July 1951, a 66-year-old Hugo Klein from Vienna, and also part of the group, wrote a separate letter to the IRO. He decided to go back to Vienna, stating that he is an Austrian citizen after all, and once again in possession of a valid passport, and therefore he should be able to return freely to Austria at any time. He organized his transport by the Austrian consulate in Tel Aviv and returned to Austria. In his letter, he described how he had visited the neighboring home for elderly every day during his stay in Israel and in the immigration camp, and how he admired the conditions there. And finally, Klein asked why the IRO did spend so much money in the first place to bring them here if they leave them in misery after all. He ends his letter with the statement, "I may say that we are more displaced than ever." What became of the rest of the group is unknown to me, but care facilities in Israel were improved in the years to come, and it is very plausible that after all, everybody was transferred to a nursing home. That brings me to the last part of this lecture. Following Hugo Klein on his journey, I now return to Austria for the last part. By the time Hugo Klein announced his plans to return to Austria in November 1950, there were still 9 rehabilitation centers operating in Germany, Austria, and Italy, with a total of 1,778 DPs receiving rehabilitation services. Significant numbers of Jewish DPs with disabilities had been able to resettle to Israel in 1950, or mostly to Israel. But when the IRO ceased its operations, thousands of hardcore DPs remained without permanent solution in Germany, Austria, and Italy. 7,544 cases, most of which non-Jewish, were still open by the end of 1951. At least several hundred of these were Jewish DPs, which had to continue living in camps or rehabilitation center, in camps until further solutions were found. In Germany, the most prominent example is Camp Föhrenwald, the last remaining Jewish DP camp in Germany. This camp has been thoroughly researched, and today there even exists an amazing memorial site to commemorate the story of these last Jewish DPs in Germany, of which many were or had hardcore status. You can find a link to the museum's site on the slide. While the closure of Camp Föhrenwald near Munich in 1975 is generally regarded as the end of the Jewish DP story, a closer look at the situation in Austria reveals that survivors still had to live in camps in Austria for years to come after that. In the last part of this lecture, I will shed light on the situation of Jewish DPs with health problems in Austria after the IAO handed over responsibility for the remaining DPs to the Austrian authorities in February 52. At that time, approximately 3,000 Jewish DPs remained in the three Austrian camps, Rothschild-Spital in Vienna, Hallein in Salzburg, and Asten in Upper Austria. Another camp, Wels in Upper Austria, was closed shortly after the turnover to Austria. About a quarter of them belonged to the medical hardcore. They faced a double challenge: the Austrian authorities' anti-Semitic bias and hostility towards Jewish refugees, and the need to improve their health in order to be accepted for immigration to states like Israel or other. For years, they lived in a state of limbo, while their able-bodied camp neighbors were able to migrate and start anew. The Austrian authorities wanted to close all Jewish DP camps as fast as possible, as soon as they took over, and bring all remaining refugees to a place called Asten in Upper Austria, where they wanted to create a big refugee camp where also non-Jewish refugees lived. Soon frictions between the different nationalities arose, and I was able to collect several accounts of anti-Semitic incidents from these other camp inhabitants towards the Jewish population of Camp Asten. I will not go into that right now because of time, and continue to talk about migration programs for these last refugees. Although special immigration programs for chronically ill and disabled Jewish refugees, mainly to care facilities in Switzerland or Scandinavia, opened up possibilities for migration during the 1950s. It was not until 1963 that permanent solutions were found by the JDC for the last Jewish DPs in Europe. By 1960, 46 Jewish refugees, former IRO DPs, so they were living in Austrian camps since shortly after liberation, still lived in Asten, among other Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe who had arrived later during the 1950s, especially Hungarian refugees who arrived around 1956. These 46 refugees had spent over 15 years in DP camps, and when they finally found permanent solutions in course of the UN refugee year 1959 to 1960, many of those were placed in permanent care institutions in Austria. I will conclude this lecture with the life story of one of them, a Polish survivor called Abraham S. He was a survivor who lived in camp-like facilities from 1946 until 1963. Abraham was born 1918 in Białystok and grew up in Poland. In 1940, he escaped to the USSR, where he was forcibly recruited by the Red Army. Owing to his refusal to serve, he was deported to Siberia, where he survived the war in a forced labor camp. And he was released to Poland in the summer of 1945. After his return, he found his former life in ruin. His whole family had perished in the Shoah. He saw no further future in Poland for himself and headed towards Western Europe, where he was registered in an Austrian DP camp in November 1946. In an interview with a medical officer in that period, he stated that he wants to go to the US, where his only living relative, an uncle, was living. In February 1947, a camp medic from the DP camp Prienburg, where he was near the city of Salzburg, transferred him to a mental hospital in Salzburg because he was found wandering around disoriented at night. In this mental institution in Salzburg, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, the most common diagnosis at that time. And in this institution, Austrian institution, he also received several treatments of electroshock therapy, which led to a decline in his mental health, as I would deduce from the sources I've seen. Electroshock treatment was the standard procedure for any form of mental illness in Austria in this period. And between 1947 and 1949, he was sent back twice to mental institutions where he received electroshock treatment once more. His second stay was over 11 months, and from November 1949 to February 1950, he lived in Camp Hallein near Salzburg, and he was scheduled to be transferred to Ebelsberg Rehabilitation Center in 1950, which indicates that his illness was developing positively at that time. But the night before he was scheduled for transport, as a result of the stress this put on him, he physically attacked a camp policeman. And this led to a hospitalization of over 1 year with several episodes of electroshock treatment. Having a record of violence in combination with his diagnosis now left him with no options whatsoever for migration. The JDC then provided longer rehabilitation treatment in a private hospital for him, which seemed to have helped him since he continued to live in Camp Hallein until its closure and was then transferred to Asten, where he continued to live throughout the 1950s. He was the last case of a Jewish IRO-DP in Europe that the JDC took care of and was eventually placed in a permanent home in Austria, in an Austrian mental institution in 1963, where he stayed until the end of his life. As you can see on this document, I have also some photos from Hallein. I forgot to show them. And here you have the document, the last document for me, where it is stated that I believe that this also represents the closure of the last Jewish displaced persons camp, Hooray, in 1963. I don't know if the hooray is kind of appropriate here, because all of the stories mentioned in this document are kind of sad or without a happy end, as I would say. This example represents just a number or numerous other cases in which a patient was unable to leave Europe for health-related reasons, although they wanted to. Jewish DPs with severe mental health conditions belonged to one of the most difficult groups to be resettled, even more so if they were alone and had no family network to support them. I think it's therefore important to highlight this case to show the diverse realities and experiences of DPs classified as hardcore, which were on the one hand where we have examples of protests and self-organization, as shown in the first part of this lecture, but also numerous cases like Abraham, who most of the time remained silent because they left no traces in the archive. I hope that it also became clear during this lecture that no matter what, the JDC tried everything they could to aid these survivors and to offer support to them everywhere around the globe. And with that, I say thank you, and special thanks to Sarah Chessin and the JDC for providing the fellowship. You can also find a link to our upcoming conference, just if you want to learn more about our project and the conference we're going to have in May. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fascinating lecture. We're now going to open the floor to questions. And as I said before, your microphones are muted, so please send us your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. So, Johannes, I'm going to start by a comment from Michael Rice, who wrote, "My late father, James Rice, was with the JDC between 1945 and 1955, and in Frankfurt between 1954 and 1955. he was very involved with helping resettle the last hardcore cases from foreign world. Your lecture greatly expands my understanding of this period. I will add two things on that. One is that we have an oral history of James Rice. I don't know if you've seen it, Johannes. And the second is, if anyone is interested in learning more about James Rice, we have a blog post that Michael has kindly written a few years ago about his dad and his aunt, who also worked for JDC.
It's very interesting. James Rice actually appears a lot in the sources I've seen, and it is always fascinating to me to meet someone who actually is related to the people I find in the archives. So thank you for your comment. That's really interesting.
Okay, so two questions now for you. The first one is, do you have any information on how the communist government treated the DPs in Shanghai during and after the revolution?
Well, I must admit, I'm not an expert on the situation of the treatment of the communist government to the DPs. My colleague Elizabeth Chernia would be the expert on this. Also, our postdoc Chai Tao. But from what I know, and I hope that I don't get it wrong now, they in the beginning they kind of left them to their own, but then they issued that all foreigners must leave China after a certain date. And this is the reason why there was so much pressure on the JDC to find solutions to bring these foreigners or deemed as foreigners out of the country. But yeah, I think that answers it a little bit. So I cannot recollect any accounts of violence against these Jewish survivors in Shanghai, but they had to leave the country at a certain point.
And another question is, were there any movement towards families in Latin America?
Yeah, sure. So that's a case I left out in this lecture because it didn't fit the lecture. But of course, these DPs were resettled all around the globe, also to Latin America. Many went to the US, to Canada, and mostly to Scandinavia in the 50s. So there are definitely cases. If you want to know more, I hope that I will be able to answer that in my dissertation.
So a question that, hold on, let's see, we have, no, I think we've asked most of the question. What remains open are people telling you how interesting the lecture was. I will just ask a question myself. A lot of the letters seem to express disgruntlement, disappointment. Why do you think this is the case?
I think on the one hand, we historians always have to be critical with our sources. Of course, that's given, because in this specific case, what ends up in the archives and is therefore accessible to us are these letters of complaints. So one seldomly took time to write to the IRO and thank them, or to describe that everything was all right. So people turned to the JDC or other organizations when they were disgruntled and when they wanted to express some protest. So if I want to study agency of these DPs, I will mostly find these letters of discomfort or of disgruntlement. So that is for one. And on the other hand, I think, of course, the situation was difficult for them, living in camps for years, seeing that many other were able to migrate. Also, the health situation might not be or might not have improved. So I think it, from a humane standpoint, it's very understandable On the other side, the JDC, it was really difficult for them to reply to these appeals, as we saw in the lecture, because in most of the cases, the situation was already quite good, as they stated, and better than in other regular DP camps. So.
Thank you, Johannes. I think this is an impression across the collection for specifically, I would say, for the World War II period. I'm familiar with with what we have on Tangier, and you see the same. You see people writing to complain, and I think it needs to. People who are happy don't write. I think it's true. It's true nowadays too. So thank you very much. I don't think we have. We have one last question. When public information agencies discuss IRO programs for disabled DPs? So I guess the question is, did the UN publicize the IRO programs?
So I think I can answer the question on several levels. During the period of the IRO, the program was publicized heavily. So I found several traces of press releases from the IRO around the world, which were also picked up by other UN agencies. There was efforts to cooperate with the with other UN agencies. Also, several films were made about the hardcore. So there was a lot of public effort going on to bring attention to this topic, especially to raise money and also to create a pressure group of people appealing to governments to take in the remaining hardcore population. And what became of the rehabilitation program is also really interesting, because it seemed to have inspired the forthcoming UN efforts for people with disabilities. So we have the UN Convention on People with Disabilities definitions coming in the 1950s, which were maybe inspired by the IRO rehabilitation efforts. And especially this external advisor I mentioned from the UK, his name was Harold sorry, I forgot his name. He was actually then later involved in these UN commissions on disabled people. So it's very interesting to look at these connections between IRO work and the later UN work on people with disabilities.
Thank you again, Johannes, and thank you to our participants for joining us today. I also want to thank again the Miriam, Mimi, Pasternak, Tobin Public Educational Programming for the JDC Archives for making this program possible. Our next webinar, which is co-sponsored by the Jewish Book Council, will take place on May 28th. Laura Hobson-Ford will give a talk about her new book, Who Will Rescue Us? The Story of Jewish Children Who Fled to France and America During the Holocaust. You can register for this program via the JDC Archives website. We are also hosting a virtual mini course with the Polin Museum on the JDC in Poland between 1914 and 1950, which will take place every Sunday in May, so starting next Sunday. Again, you can find details about the course and register for it via our website. Please sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for upcoming public programs. Thank you, and have a great day.